My cousin registered our grandmother's business in her own name while Grandma was in hospital. Grandma had already added me as co-owner. My name is Delia Marsh, and I was 34. The Thursday morning, my phone received an alert from the state business registry. I had set up the alert 14 months earlier. Standard practice for anyone whose name appears on a registered business entity. Any change to the registration triggers a notification. Name changes, address changes, ownership amendments, any change. The alert arrived at 7:41 in the morning while I was making coffee. It said, "Amendment filed, Bloom and Company Floral Design, LLC. Ownership information updated." I set the coffee down. I opened the registry portal on my phone. I pulled up the filing. The amendment had been submitted at 11:53 the previous evening. It listed the new sole owner of Bloom and Company Floral Design. My cousin Tessa's name. Not my grandmother's name. Not my name. Tessa's. I read it twice. Then I called the hospital. My grandmother had been admitted 4 days earlier. A cardiac episode, serious enough to require monitoring and rest, and the specific enforced stillness that my grandmother, a woman who had run a floral design business for 31 years and who had never in my memory been willingly still, found genuinely distressing. The nurse said she was stable. She said she had rested well. She said visiting hours started at 10. I said I would be there. I said, "Please tell her Delia is coming." I said, "Please tell her it is important." I hung up. I looked at the registry amendment on my phone. Tessa had filed it at 11:53 the previous evening, while our grandmother was in a hospital bed 4 days into a cardiac episode. While the business our grandmother had built for 31 years was sitting without its owner and without its co-owner, because the co-owner had been spending every available hour at the hospital. Tessa had waited until the coast was clear. She had waited until our grandmother was hospitalized, and I was occupied, and the business was unattended. She had filed at 11:53 at night. She had not called anyone. She had not asked anyone. She had simply filed. She had done it the way people do things they know are wrong, quickly, in the dark, without witnesses. What she did not know was that 14 months ago my grandmother had added my name to the business registration as co-owner. What she did not know was that co-owners receive notifications. What she did not know was that I had been standing in front of this exact scenario since the day my grandmother handed me the co-ownership certificate and said, "Keep this somewhere safe." I had kept it somewhere safe. It was in the fireproof cabinet in my home office, behind my own documents, exactly where my grandmother had told me to put it. I drank my coffee. I called my attorney. Welcome back to 2 a.m. Revenge, where the quiet ones who kept every receipt finally get the room they deserved. If you have ever had someone commit fraud against your family while the person they were stealing from was in a hospital bed, this story is for you. Drop a comment below and subscribe so the next one finds you. My grandmother's name is Rose Bloom, and she is 83 years old, and she is the most alive person I have ever known. Not in the energetic way, in the specific way of someone who has decided that being alive is worth doing fully, and who has maintained that decision across 8 decades without revision. She started Bloom and Company, floral design, in her kitchen when she was 52, not from a dream, from a Wednesday. She had been working as a florist for a large grocery chain for 11 years, and on a Wednesday they eliminated her position in a restructuring, and she drove home, and she sat at her kitchen table, and she said to the empty room, "Well." Then she picked up the phone and called the first client she had ever personally brought to the grocery store's floral department, a woman named Margaret who ordered arrangements for her law firm's reception area every 2 weeks. And she said, "Margaret, I am starting my own business. Will you come with me?" Margaret said yes. She said it immediately. She said she had been waiting for Rose to do exactly this. Rose had not known Margaret felt that way. She filed the business registration the following Monday, Bloom and Company, floral design. Her name, her business. Her 31 years of building client relationships and refining her craft and understanding that a florist does not sell flowers. A florist sells the feeling of a room when the flowers arrive. She had built something real, something that had outlasted the grocery chain that had let her go, something that had grown from one client to 212 over 31 years. Something that was, at the time of her hospitalization, valued as a going concern at approximately $420,000, and that had 6 employees and a client list that included 4 law firms, 2 hotels, a hospital whose irony she noted regularly, and the kind of loyal individual clients who had been ordering from her for so long. They called her by her first name and asked about her grandchildren. She had built all of it. Every relationship, every arrangement, every early morning at the flower market. Hers. My role in the business had been specific and consistent. I am a business paralegal. I have been for 9 years. My specialty is small business legal compliance, the registrations and the contract reviews and the employment agreements and the specific ongoing maintenance that keeps a small business legally sound. My grandmother had been my first pro bono client, not because she could not afford professional help, because she trusted me. She said it directly, on my first day working with her formally. She said, "Delia, I could hire someone." She said, "I am choosing you because you are family and because you are good and because I want someone who has a reason beyond the hourly rate to care whether this is done correctly." I said I would not let her down. She said, "I know." She said, "That is why I chose you." I had been doing her legal compliance for 7 years. Every registration renewal, every contract review, every employment agreement. I knew the business the way you know something you have maintained carefully for a long time, not just the surface, but the structure underneath. My cousin Tessa knew the business differently. She knew it as a resource. Tessa is 38 to my 34. She had worked in the business twice. Once in year 12 when she needed temporary income, and our grandmother gave her a position in the shop front. She stayed for 8 months. She left when something more convenient presented itself. Once in year 26 when she came back with the specific energy of a person who has decided that the thing she overlooked before was more valuable than she realized. She stayed for 14 months. She left again, this time with opinions about how the business should be run that she delivered to our grandmother with the confidence of someone who has been present for 14 months and has decided that qualifies as expertise. Our grandmother received the opinions with the warmth she brought to everything and changed nothing. After the second departure, Tessa maintained a relationship with the business that I can only describe as interested proximity. She visited the shop. She called our grandmother regularly. She attended family events and spoke about the business with the familiarity of someone who considered herself connected to it. She was connected to it. What she was not was essential to it. That distinction is the whole story. The co-ownership happened 14 months before the hospitalization. My grandmother called me on a Sunday afternoon. She said she wanted to talk about something practical. I said, "Okay." She said she had been thinking about the business. She said she had been thinking about what happened to it if something happened to her. I said she should not worry about that yet. She said, "Delia." I said, "Yes." She said, "I am 83 years old." She said, "Worrying about it is not the word." She said, "Planning for it is the word." She said, "Come Tuesday." I came Tuesday. She had her documents spread on the kitchen table. The business registration, the operating agreement, the client contracts, and a form she had already partially completed, a co-ownership amendment to the business registration. Her name and my name taunt equal ownership. She said, "I want you on this officially." She said, "You have been managing the legal compliance for 7 years." She said, "You know this business better than anyone except me." She said, "When I am not here, I want you to be the one who decides what happens to it." I said, "Grandma, She said, I know. She said, it is a lot. She said, you can say no. I said, I am not saying no. I said, I want to understand what you are asking. She said, I am asking you to be my partner. She said, officially. She said, on paper. She said, in the registry. She said, I want it documented while I can document it clearly. I said, what about Tessa? She looked at me. She said, what about Tessa? I said, she has worked here. I said, she is family. She said, yes. She said, and you have been here every week for 7 years. She said, and I trust you with what I built. She said, and those two things are the basis of this decision. She said, Tessa will receive what the estate distributes. She said, the business is a different matter. She said, the business goes to the person who has been taking care of it. I said, okay. She said, good. She said, sign here. We filed the amendment together. I submitted it to the state registry that afternoon. I set up the notification alerts on the registration that same evening. Standard practice. Any change? Any amendment? I would know. I put the co-ownership certificate in the fireproof cabinet. I went home. I thought about it for a week. Then I went back to work. The business was still there every Tuesday. Our grandmother was still at the kitchen table. Life continued. For 14 months, life continued normally. Then she went into the hospital, and Tessa filed at 11:53 on a Wednesday night. I want to tell you about the 4 days between my grandmother's admission and Tessa's filing. Not because they are dramatic, because they tell you everything about the two versions of love in this story. Day 1. I drove my grandmother to the hospital when she called me, not Tessa. Me. She called me because I was the one she called. Day 2. I was at the hospital by 8 in the morning. I brought her crossword books, the specific edition she preferred. I knew the edition because I had been bringing them every week for 3 years. Day 3, I coordinated with the business manager, a woman named June, who had worked for my grandmother for 11 years, to ensure the day-to-day operations continued without disruption. I called the 2 largest clients personally. I told them my grandmother was resting and that everything was handled. They asked me to give her their love. Day 4. I was at the hospital from 9 until 7. My grandmother was anxious about the shop. I sat beside her bed and went through the week's orders on my laptop and showed her everything was managed. She relaxed. She said, Delia. I said yes. She said, what would I do without you? I said you would manage. She said no. She said I would not. She said not as well. She squeezed my hand. I stayed until 7. I drove home. At 11:53, Tessa filed the amendment. She had not visited the hospital once in 4 days. Not once. She had sent a card. I know, because my grandmother showed it to me. A card. While the business her grandmother had built for 31 years was being registered in her own name in the dark. I called my attorney at 7:52 that Thursday morning. Her name is Ruth Pelham. She answered on the second ring. I told her what the notification said. She was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, send me the filing. I sent it while she was still on the phone. She read it. She said, Delia. I said yes. She said, this is fraudulent registration. She said, Tessa has filed a false ownership amendment to a business she does not own. She said, you are the co-owner of record. She said the amendment she filed did not include your signature. She said any amendment to the ownership structure of a registered LLC requires the consent of all existing members. She said you did not consent. She said your signature is not on this filing. She said the filing is void. She said we need to challenge it immediately. I said, how quickly? She said, today. She said, I will file the challenge with the state registry this morning. She said, I will flag it as fraudulent registration. She said the registry will suspend the amendment pending investigation. She said, depending on the investigation outcome, this may be referred to the Attorney General's office. She said, Delia. I said, yes. She said, this is not a paperwork dispute. She said, what Tessa did has a name. I said, I know. She said, "Do you want me to proceed?" I said, "Yes." I said, "Ruth?" She said, "Yes." I said, "My grandmother is in the hospital." I said, "She is 83 years old and she is in a hospital bed, and her granddaughter filed this while she was in there." Ruth was quiet. Then she said, "I will have the challenge filed by 9 o'clock. She said, "Is there anything else you need from me this morning?" I said, "I need you to be thorough." She said, "I am always thorough." I said, "I know." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Go see your grandmother." I said, "I am on my way." I did not tell my grandmother about the filing that morning. I want to be precise about why. She was in a hospital bed recovering from a cardiac episode. She was 83 years old. She was anxious and she was tired, and she was doing the specific hard work of a body demanding rest from a person who had spent 83 years treating rest as an interruption. I was not going to add this to what she was carrying. Not yet. Not until I had the situation under control. That was Thursday. By Thursday afternoon, Ruth had filed the challenge. By Friday morning, the registry had suspended the amendment pending review. By Friday afternoon, the registry investigator had called Ruth and confirmed that the filing appeared to lack the required co-owner's signature and consent. By Friday evening, Ruth had spoken with the Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, which handled business fraud. By Saturday morning, I had a complete picture of where things stood. The amendment was suspended. The investigation was open. Tessa had not yet been notified officially. She would be. I decided to tell her first, not out of courtesy, out of the specific professional instinct of a business paralegal who understood that the way you handle a confrontation determines what comes after it. I called Tessa on Saturday. She answered warmly, the specific warmth of someone who doesn't yet know she has been caught. She said, "Delia, how is Grandma doing?" I said, "She is stable." I said, "Tessa, I need to talk to you about something." She said, "Of course." I said, "In person." I said, "Can you come to the shop on Monday?" She said, "The shop?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Is everything okay?" I said, "Come Monday and we will talk." She said, "Okay." She said, "Of course." I said, "Thank you." I hung up. I spent Sunday preparing. If you have ever watched someone commit fraud against your family while the person they were stealing from was alive in a hospital bed, stay with me. Subscribe so this story reaches you all the way to the end, because the Monday morning meeting at my grandmother's shop is the reason Tessa understood what her grandmother had already done before she ever touched that registration form. Monday morning, Bloom & Coda floral design. The shop my grandmother had been opening every Tuesday through Saturday for 31 years. The smell of it, roses and eucalyptus, and the specific green freshness of cut stems in cold water that I had been walking into for 7 years of Tuesday visits. June was at the front arranging a delivery order. She looked at me when I came in. She knew something was happening, not the specifics. The specific quality of the Monday morning told her. I had never been in the shop on a Monday before. I said, "Good morning, June." She said, "Good morning." She said, "How is Rose?" I said, "She is improving." She said, "Good." She said, "Delia?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Whatever it is you are handling." She looked at the folder in my hand. "I'm glad you are handling it." I said, "Thank you, June." She said, "She always said you were the right one." I said, "I know." I said, "She told me too." June went back to the arrangement. I went to the office at the back of the shop, my grandmother's office, her desk, her filing cabinet, the framed photograph on the wall of the shop on its first day, Rose in an apron with Margaret standing beside her, holding the arrangement that became Bloom & Co.'s first delivery. I sat at her desk. I placed my folder on it. Ruth arrived at 9. Tessa arrived at 9:15. She came in through the front. She stopped in the doorway of the office when she saw Ruth. She said she had not known there would be others. I said, "Ruth is the business attorney." She said, "The business attorney," she said, "on a Monday?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Is something wrong with the business?" I said, "Sit down, Tessa." She sat. I placed the state registry alert on the desk between us, the Thursday morning notification, the one that had arrived at 7:41. She looked at it. Her face did not change immediately. She was reading. Then she looked up. She said, "There must be a mistake." I said, "There is no mistake." I placed the full amendment filing beside the alert. Her name, her submission. 11:53, Wednesday night. She said I was just trying to protect the business. I said, "From whom?" She said, "From what happens when Grandma..." She stopped. She said I was thinking about the future. I said, "By filing an ownership amendment without my consent." She said I did not think. I said, "Ruth." Ruth placed the co-ownership certificate on the desk, dated 14 months ago, my grandmother's signature, my name filed with the state registry, recorded and confirmed. Tessa looked at it. She looked at the date. She looked at my name. She said, "I did not know about this." I said, "I know." I said, "Our grandmother filed it 14 months ago." I said she did it because she wanted the business to be protected. I said she wanted the person who had been taking care of it to be on the registration officially. I said she did not tell you because it was her decision to make, and she made it. Tessa looked at the certificate. She said, "So I have no..." She stopped. Ruth said, as a non-member of the LLC, Tessa had no authority to file ownership amendments. She said the amendment Tessa had filed was invalid. She said it had been suspended by the registry pending investigation. She said the investigation had been referred to the Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. She said filing a false ownership amendment to a registered business was a serious matter. She said the consequences depended on the investigation outcome. Tessa looked at the folder in front of me. She looked at Ruth. She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "That depends on what you do." She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I mean that what happens next is partly up to you." She said, "I did not mean to..." I said, "Tessa." She stopped. I said, "Our grandmother is in a hospital bed." I said, "You filed this while she was in there." I said, "You filed it on Wednesday night." I said, "She was admitted Sunday." I said, "You had 4 days." I said, "You did not visit once." She looked at the desk. I said, "You sent a card." She said I was going to visit. I said, "But you filed first." She said nothing. The room was very quiet. June was in the front of the shop. I could hear the sound of stems being cut, the specific clean sound of a business operating on a Tuesday the way it had operated for 31 years. I said, "Tessa." She looked up. I said, "I need you to understand what you did." I said, "You attempted to register a business you do not own in your name." I said, "While the person who owns it was in the hospital." I said, "While I was spending every available hour beside her bed." I said, "You did it at 11:53 at night." I said, "Without calling anyone." I said, "Without asking anyone." I said, "You did it because you thought no one would notice until it was too late to reverse." She said, She stopped. She said, "I thought the business would just..." She stopped again. I said, "Say it." She said, "I thought it would come to me." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I worked here." I said, "For 8 months and 14 months across 31 years. She said, "It is her business." I said, "Yes." I said, "It is." I said, "And she decided what happened to it." I said, 14 months ago. I said, "With a certificate." I said, "And a registry filing." I said, "And a notification system that told me within hours what you did at 11:53 on a Wednesday night." Tessa looked at the co-ownership certificate. She said, "I did not know she had done this." I said, "I know." She said, "She never told me." I said, "She did not need to tell you." She said, "I would have." She stopped. I said, "You would have what?" She did not answer. Because the answer to that sentence was the whole problem. She would have objected. She would have argued. She would have done exactly what she had done at 11:53 on Wednesday night, but earlier, and in a different form. My grandmother had known. She had not told Tessa because telling Tessa would have created the argument, and my grandmother had not needed the argument. She had needed the document. She had filed it. She had been right. I said, "I am going to tell you what happens now." She said, "Okay." I said, "The registry investigation will proceed regardless." I said, "That is not in my control." I said, "The referral to the Attorney General's office is also not in my control." I said, "What is in my control is whether I provide a supporting statement to the investigation." I said, "And what I communicate to our grandmother when she is well enough to have this conversation." Tessa looked at the desk. I said, "I do not want to destroy you." I said, "I want to be clear about that." She said, "Then, what do you want?" I said, "I want you to withdraw the amendment." She said, "It is already suspended." I said, "A suspension is different from a withdrawal." I said, "I want you to file a formal withdrawal stating that the amendment was filed in error." I said, "Today." She said, "Today." I said, "Today." I said, "Ruth will prepare the withdrawal form." She said, "And if I do that?" I said, "Then I provide a statement to the investigation that the matter has been resolved through voluntary correction." I said, "I make no further claim." I said, "The investigation outcome is still not in my control." I said, "But a voluntary withdrawal and correction is received differently than a contested fraud case." She said, "And Grandma?" I said, "Our grandmother will know?" She said, "When?" I said, "When she is well enough." I said, "I will not withhold it from her." She said, "She will be so angry." I said, "Yes." She said, "She will be so disappointed." I said, "Yes." I said, "Tessa." She looked at me. I said, "You filed a fraudulent business registration while she was in a hospital bed." I said, "She is 83 years old." I said, "She built this for 31 years." I said, "Of course she will be disappointed." Tessa looked at the photograph on the wall, Rose in her apron, Margaret beside her. The first arrangement, 31 years ago. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "I will sign the withdrawal." Ruth slid it across the desk. Tessa read it. She signed it. Ruth took it. She said she would file it within the hour. She stood up. She left. Tessa and I sat in our grandmother's office for a moment after Ruth left. Neither of us said anything. Then Tessa said she was going to the hospital. I said, "Okay." She said, "Today." I said, "Okay." She said, "I am going to tell her what I did." I said, "That is up to you." She said, "No." She said, "It is not up to me." She said, "It is what I should do." I said, "Yes." She said, "It is what she deserves to hear from me." I said, "Yes." She stood up. She looked at the photograph one more time. She said, "She built something real here." I said, "Yes." She said, "I wanted some of it." I said, "I know." She said, "I went about it wrong." I said, "Yes." She said, "Very wrong." I said, "Yes." She picked up her bag. She said, "Delia." I said, "Yes." She said, "Take care of it." Not a question, not a request, a statement, like she was finally placing something down correctly. I said, "I will." She said, "I know." She left. I sat at my grandmother's desk for a while after Tessa left. The shop sounds came through the door. June cutting stems, the refrigerator unit humming, the phone ringing once and being answered on the second ring, the specific sounds of 31 years of operation continuing without interruption. I looked at the framed photograph, my grandmother in her apron, 52 years old, starting something from a Wednesday and a phone call, and a woman named Margaret who said she had been waiting. I thought about the Sunday afternoon 14 months ago, the documents on the kitchen table, the co-ownership certificate, her signature, my name. Keep this somewhere safe. I had kept it somewhere safe. It had held. My grandmother came home from the hospital 11 days later. Tessa had visited on Monday afternoon. She had told her, "I know because my grandmother called me that Monday evening." She said, "Tessa came." I said, "I know." She said she told me what she did. I said, "Yes." She said, Delia. I said, yes. She said, you handled it. I said, yes. She said, without telling me while I was in there. I said, I did not want you to worry. She said, I know. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the certificate held. I said, yes. She said, I filed it 14 months ago. I said, yes. She said, I knew. She said, not specifically. She said, I knew that the business needed to be protected and that protection required paper and that I needed to file the paper while I could still file it clearly. I said, yes. She said I was right. I said, you were always right about the important things. She said, not always. She said, but about the paper. She said, yes. She said, always about the paper. I said, yes. I said, always about the paper. She said, come Tuesday. I said, I always come Tuesday. She said, I know. She said, bring the good coffee. I said, I always bring the good coffee. She said, Delia. I said, yes. She said, thank you. I said, you filed the certificate 14 months ago. I said, you did the work. She said, we both did the work. I said, yes. I said, we did. The registry investigation concluded 6 weeks later. The voluntary withdrawal Tessa had filed was noted in the finding. The investigator recommended no criminal referral given the prompt voluntary correction and the lack of any actual transfer of assets or revenue. The business had not changed hands, not for a moment, not even technically. The amendment had been suspended within hours. The co-ownership had been continuous throughout. Bloom and Company floral design remained exactly what it had always been. My grandmother's business, my co-ownership. Nothing had transferred, nothing had been lost. The certificate had held before anything could be taken. My grandmother came back to the shop 3 weeks after leaving the hospital, not full-time, 2 mornings a week, on her terms, at her pace. On the first Tuesday she came back, she walked through the front door in her apron, and June looked up from the arrangement she was building and said, "Good morning, Rose." My grandmother said, "Good morning, June." She went to the back office. She sat at her desk. She looked at the photograph on the wall. She looked at the folder with the co-ownership certificate that I had moved from the fireproof cabinet to the desk so she could see it. She picked it up. She read her own signature. She read my name. She set it down. She said, "Delia." I said, "Yes." She said, "We built something real here." I said, "Yes." She said, "It is still here." I said, "Yes." She said, "Good." She said, "That is all that matters." She opened the order book. She started working. The original business license is framed beside the first day photograph. My grandmother hung it the week she came back. She asked me to hang it for her. She said it should be visible. She said the documents that matter should be seen. I hung it at her eye level. She stood back and looked at it. Bloom and Company. Floral design. Rose Bloom. Registered. 31 years ago. She said, "You know what I have always believed." I said, "Tell me." She said, "A business is not the product." She said, "A business is not the clients." She said, "A business is not even the name." She said, "A business is the decision to start." She said, "Everything after that is just showing up." She said, "Every Tuesday," she said, "for 31 years. She said, "Showing up is the whole of it." I said, "Yes." I said, "It is." She looked at the license. She said, "I filed that in 1993. She said it was the most important document I ever signed. She said, "Until the co-ownership certificate." I said, "Grandma." She said, "That one I filed for you." She said, "Because you showed up." She said, "Every Tuesday," she said, "for 7 years." She said, "Showing up is the whole of it." I said, "I know." She said, "Go make the coffee." I said, "Yes." I went to make the coffee. The shop opened. Tuesday continued the way it had continued for 31 years. That is my story. 31 years of a business, 14 months of a certificate. One amendment filed at 11:53 on a Wednesday night by someone who did not know about the notification system, and a Thursday morning coffee that went cold while I read the alert. If you have a family business and your name is not on the registration, Put it on. Not tomorrow. This week, call the attorney, file the amendment, get the notification alerts. Because the people who want what you built are not going to wait for a convenient moment. They are going to file at 11:53 on a Wednesday night while the person who built it is in a hospital bed, and the only thing standing between your grandmother's 31 years and someone else's registration is a certificate in a fireproof cabinet and an alert that arrives at 7:41 in the morning. Get the certificate, set the alert, show up every Tuesday. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment and tell me which part of this story stayed with you. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.